All right, so today we're going to be diving right into a topic that is very important to understanding diversity in the United States, that being biological sex, gender as a social construct, and sexuality. If you're unfamiliar with Georgia O'Keeffe's work, I have a painting here on the right. You may be able to pick up on this if you are familiar with her work, but otherwise know that a common theme that her work has is that there is a vagina somewhere on it, either explicit, which this one is more explicit, or very subtle and on the corners of the margins of the pages sometimes. When I'm having you all think about sex in terms of how people understand it, just know that your perspective can play a big role in how you see the world and other people as well. This class, and anthropology in general, takes what we can conceptualize as the coat rack approach to biological sex and gender as a social construct. So by sex, we're going to define this as biological state of being. Very simple definition. So for instance, you are either biologically male or biologically female. You will know after watching Intersection that, of course, there is a lot more to be said than this sort of binary that we use between male and female, but that is the one that is most commonly used in our society and also in the scholarship. Then we get to something that is more deeply ingrained within anthropology, and that is the concept of gender, which we can think of as the social, cultural, and psychological constructs imposed on sex. I call it the coat rack approach because there is the physical structure of the coat rack, the actual wooden frame here in the photo. That's what you have to work with in terms of your biology. And then what you put on the coat rack is your gender. You decide what clothing you want to wear and how you want to express yourself, basically, through your attire and through your actions. So, sex is the physical structure of the coat rack, while gender is what you can hang on the coat rack. I hope this makes sense. This actually is an example that I've heard multiple times from other anthropology professors. I think it's a good way to sort of saliently see what we're talking about when we say there is a difference between biological sex and gender. So this is not a biology class, so I will spare you the intricate details, but there are different ways to sort of understand biological sex. You can think about it in terms of your physical genitalia, for instance, if you have a penis or a vagina, but that is not always a good indicator when you're looking at a different scale, such as that of the chromosomal level. So there is the X and Y chromosomes, and we generally conceptualize XX combinations as female and XY as male. However, there are occurrences, actually not entirely that rare, more common than it was originally believed, that there are other combinations that are possible. So for instance, there are XXY individuals that are out there, and a lot of them don't even know that they have an extra X or Y chromosome. They are undiagnosed. They are walking around and maybe they believe that they are, at the chromosomal level, a female, having XXY chromosomes. These are called super females, basically, because they have that additional chromosome. But again, they could show and they could present no real physical differences than anyone else, and the only way they would find out is if they were diagnosed, essentially. There are other combinations that are available, and also different combinations of genitalia that are available as well. So just know that the common conception that there is only two biological sexes doesn't really correspond to reality, and that reality is shaped by different combinations of chromosomes, different combinations of genitalia, and also different combinations of how we conceptualize the world through biological sex. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it is messy. And when I'm saying male and female, just know that this is because it is a necessary concession I have to make, because that is what we use. This is the language that we use. In terms of linguistics, which I'll get into later in the semester, words have a lot of power and meaning, and how you use those words and also reify their usage over time can have a large impact in how you perceive reality. That is a more metaphysical discussion than you probably were wondering for a concept that should be as simple as biological sex, but biological sex is not simple. So, looking at the fetus as another way of conceptualizing biological sex, before and around the 9-week mark, every embryo has the same potential for development. There really is no distinction that can be seen physically between a XY or XX chromosomal fetus. However, at around the 9-week mark, this indifferent genital development begins to develop into genital tubercle. Basically, you start to see a little bit of a difference now, and this external genitalia around the 20 to 21 week mark can be seen physically via ultrasound. So, for the most part, we all kind of start the same, and it isn't until we start to gestate in the womb that you start to see a lot of the physical differences that we attribute to biological sex start to develop. Of course, I mentioned it also on the previous slide, but there is also the discussion of intersex, which is very important here, which we're defining as the presence of intermediate or ambiguous forms or atypical combinations of genitalia. I have atypical here in the sense of statistics in terms of the norm. The norm is either you have a penis or you have a vagina, of course, but there are other combinations that are possible, and don't think of atypical in a negative light. It just means that is not the norm. And by norm, that also is a very loaded term because it could mean that I'm implying that one is accepted and one is not. Well, in society, there has been a lot of work to try and improve perceptions of intersex individuals, but largely we're not there yet. Additionally, the term intersex itself kind of, again, reifies the distinction we use in this binary of male or female. You're either sort of in between when you're saying you're intersex. But we should really conceptualize sexuality as a continuum, and also, sorry, not sexuality, but also biological sex as a continuum. We'll get into sexuality in a little bit. But in terms of biological sex, there are just different combinations that are available. And that's really it. These different combinations make us who we are in terms of our physical appearance. But that physical appearance may not correspond to how we conceptualize ourselves either in terms of gender. So, diving right into gender, we can think of this as the expectations of thought and behavior that each culture assigns to people of different sexes. You can see here where we're starting to put gender on biological sex. And by we, I mean culture. So breaking this down, just to make this more explicit, you have your identity, which is literally what you identify as. Do you see yourself as a man, a woman, as gender non-conforming? And all of those are culturally mediated. What it means to be a man is based on the expectations, which you have here at the bottom. There are expectations as to how a man should behave. There are expectations as to how a woman should behave. This also applies to what jobs you occupy, what clothing you wear, how you interact with other biological sexes and genders. These are all historically mediated based on cultural practices over time, and then when you are born, during your development, you pick up on a lot of social cues and expectations as to how you should express your gender. Again, think of expression of gender as that coat rack again. What clothing do you put on? How do you present yourself? How do you perform being a man in society? All of these things are not set in stone. They're not set in your biology. They're set in your cultural practices and norms and expectations about the world. And those expectations will start to shape your conception of how you should interact with other people and how you conceptualize yourself as a person. So I've mentioned the term social construct a lot, and that may be confusing to some of you. So let's break down this term because it is going to be used throughout the semester. And you should also be familiar with this as just a member of the United States Society, because it may come up and it is relevant in a lot of different circumstances. So A definition of this term is an idea that has been created and accepted by the people in a community or society that is informed by history and can change over time. So that is saying a lot. Let's sort of pick apart what I just said. So an idea that has been created and accepted by people in a community. So in terms of, let's take food for an example. There are certain foods that certain communities like to consume. It is a part of their staple diet. At Feeding Tampa Bay, a food bank in Tampa, they ran into an issue where a lot of foods that were being donated largely fit a Western palate. Think bread, cereal, and ground beef. There are certain cultures where this is not a part of their normal diet and their palate in particular. And what ended up happening was Feeding Tampa Bay found out that a lot of individuals from other cultures other than those that are predominantly Western either did not like the food that was at the food bank, or they just didn't know how to cook or use the food. So food itself is a physical thing. You consume it. However, what you consider to be food is a cultural construct. It is built up over time in the history of a culture and the intermixing of cultures as well. In terms of gender being a social construct, as I said before, there are different ways of understanding what it means to be a man depending on your culture. It is said in Latin America there is a concept called machismo, basically a heightened form of masculinity, where individuals need to be hypersexual beings, essentially. And also, this sort of plays into traditional gender roles, as they are called. For instance, that women are homemakers and men are providers. Again, nothing in our biology that says this has to be the case. This has just been the history of how gender has been intermixing with each other and interacting with each other over time. Gender is also performative. I want you to go to this link here and just watch this very short clip, and so you have a better idea of what I mean by gender being something that is performed and is performative as well, because they don't mean the exact same thing either. Also, gender does not imply any specific form of sexual orientation. This is a very important note to consider. You can be a cisgendered white male that is heterosexual, homosexual, or pansexual, for instance. There's nothing that says that if you are male, you must like females. There's nothing that says if you're a female, you must like males. Sexuality, again, you can conceptualize it best as a continuum, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But just know that it's very important to not conflate sex and sexuality and gender and sexuality either. In terms of why I have the Ken doll here in a dress, this would probably be atypical for a lot of individuals to see a male doll wearing a pink floofy dress. Is it wrong? No, it's just atypical. We don't expect this to be their behavior. And also, we don't expect them to be wearing clothes which we typically assign to women or biological females. Again, nothing in our biology that says that women must wear dresses. It is just more generally accepted, whether or not that is correct or not. I would say that is entirely culturally constructed, that women wear dresses. This discussion naturally brings us to transgender, which we will define as a person whose gender identity differs from the biological sex the person has or had or was identified or assigned at birth. On the note of assigning sex, this actually is done all the time in hospital settings. When you are born, generally the doctor will assign you a sex. This is a female or this is a male. If they are unsure, because for instance the genital area might be ambiguous, they often will just pick one and go with it. And parents may or may not have a say in that. Additionally, gender identity is a social construct, so no identity is more correct than another. Think of cultural relativism here as another example. So, in India, for instance, there is a so-called third gender called the Hijra. And additionally, in the United States, a lot of indigenous populations have what is called a two-spirit individual, and they may occupy both being a biological male or biological female or a man and a woman at the same time, based on cultural understandings and expectations of how this gender role should behave. On that note, gender is a performance, as I mentioned on the previous slide. It is something we actively participate in and act out for ourselves and others. When I walk out the door every day, without really thinking about it, I am acting as a man. Me acting as a man has been shaped by my upbringing into what it means to be a man and how men should interact with other people. I don't consciously think about this, it's just something that is a learned behavior over time, which is why it's important from an anthropological perspective to really dive into cultural practices when you are studying them, because a lot of behavior that people do and think about is not something that they are consciously sitting down and conceptualizing, okay, why am I doing this? This is just how they act. This is how the world is supposed to work. This can raise some issues in terms of transgender individuals because they experience high rates of stigma and violence, sexual or otherwise, largely because their identity and their performance of their identity can violate some expected norms and behaviors. Norms and behaviors are other key terms to really latch on to here again, because again, if I'm walking out the door expecting to interact with what I conceptualize to be men and women, all being cisgendered, of course, so they are males and they are females, when I'm seeing individuals that violate that expectation, I may become uncomfortable. And that discomfort can lead to a lot of discrimination for transgender individuals. So we need to be really conscious about what we say is right or wrong based on our understanding, which is very limited and culturally mediated about the world. Individuals that may identify as transgender are not more or less correct in terms of how they see the world. They are just people, and we are all people that collectively make society, and we understand each other as members of our larger society. We're going to dive into stuff now, because anthropology also is concerned with the stuff that we take value in and use on a daily basis. So material culture, this is the stuff, the things we use and we have, is a very important indicator of how we interact with the world and how we even conceptualize gender. Through enculturation, which is the process of learning a culture, we prescribe things to certain genders. So, for instance, in the US and in other countries sometimes, there are popular gender reveal parties where, for instance, a family member will want to surprise their family by having a party where they reveal the gender. So for instance, they may have a pink cake or a blue cake, or they might do blue confetti, because for historical reasons, we attribute blue to boys and pink to girls. As a side note, in history, at one point this was reversed, and pink was considered to be a more masculine color, while blue was a more softer color reserved for women. This has changed over time, of course, and for the most part, this still has taken hold of how we conceptualize even something as sort of mundane as color in terms of assigning it to a certain gender. Of course, some individuals are trying to change this over time in expectations, but it's difficult to change ingrained cultural practices. This can even extend to the toys we play with. Boys are supposed to play with Tonka trucks, and girls play with Barbie dolls. Girls wear dresses while men wear suits. Boys play hockey while girls do cheerleading. Nothing in our biology says we must do these things. We are assigned this category. It is just how, in our culture, we conceptualize gender roles, and this can even be extended to the jobs we perform. So, for instance, men are supposed to be coders while women are supposed to be homemakers, as an example. This, of course, does not need to correspond to reality. There's nothing in our biology that says this is the case. These are just expectations that people have, and these expectations can and will change over time, especially in terms of jobs and professions and toys that were once reserved for men or boys are now starting to be more widely accepted to be used by women. There are still large disparities. So, for instance, gender wage gaps and professions that predominantly hire men over women. But progress is being made, or at least change is being made over time. I say this because this also applies to cultural practices. Outside of what I'm using here as examples, culture changes over time, and with that, so does expectations and understandings of gender, sexuality, and other topics in our society. Now onto the subject of sexuality, and it's really a shame that we only have 1 week to really engage with this topic, but as I said in the previous PowerPoint, I will be engaging with all of these topics, sexuality, sex, and gender, throughout the semester. So I think that I have the bases covered, essentially. So in terms of sexuality, we can think of this in terms of erotic desire, sexual practice, and/or sexual orientation. There are different ways to understand almost every single topic. In anthropology, again, we have a hard time coming up with a singular definition that everyone is happy with. So I'm leaving one here that is a little bit more open. So for instance, you may identify as heterosexual, but you may perform an act that some might consider to be homosexual. These categories themselves are just social constructs that we make and reify and reproduce and understand as a member of a particular culture. In terms of sexual orientation, you can think about this in terms of a person's attraction or lack of to a particular sex or gender. This is the category we like to assign ourselves or to others. You are heterosexual, you are homosexual, you are pansexual, you are asexual. Your gender does not determine, again, I want to emphasize, your sexuality or vice versa. You can maintain different categories as a member of the human population, basically. Nothing says you must act a certain way, you must like certain individuals over others in our biology. On that note, human sexuality is, well, it's complicated. And different researchers throughout history have tried to really nail down what our sexuality really is at the biological level, at the chromosomal level, at the cellular level, trying to find something maybe in our DNA, but the answer really is elusive. And there's a reason for that. And it is because sexuality is also culturally constructed. As I say at the bottom, these categories are not exhaustive. You can think of sexuality really as being fluid and non-rigid. By that, I mean we may have categories such as heterosexual, as homosexual, as pansexual, but you may identify as one and do something that is atypical for that sexual orientation. Individuals may, for instance, be asexual, which is a lack of sexual attraction to others. Literally, you just are not attracted to other individuals, or you take no satisfaction in sexual acts. There's homosexual, there's heterosexual, there's bisexual, of course, and then there's pansexual as well. These definitions are sort of creating the conception, I fear, that these are it. However, there really is a continuum of sexuality, which is why I say it is fluid. These categories are themselves social constructs, and this list is, I want to hammer in, not exhaustive. The Kinsey scale of sexual behavior is a very commonly cited one, and Kinsey, I think his first name was Alfred Kinsey, was basically a scholar on human sexuality. Primarily, he would sample college students because, just so you know, college students are one of the easiest populations to sample, and also college students are very sexually active too, so it made sense to sample college students. And what Kinsey sort of found in his research is that you really can think about sexuality as a continuum. This is a gross oversimplification. Nowadays, we know that it is a lot more complicated in the scholarship than what he has here on his Kinsey scale. But this is a good way to sort of think about it. So for instance, you have the bisexual behavior continuum essentially at the bottom, where heterosexual relationships only are on the left and homosexual are on the right. And then as you're progressing, you get more or less heterosexual or homosexual. These categories, again, I don't want you to memorize the Kinsey scale as like the end-all be-all. It's just an example of how researchers have tried to conceptualize a very messy topic such as sexual orientation. So, as I am a medical anthropologist, I really cannot talk about these topics without also bringing in different aspects of mental and physical health as well. So, there is the concept of gender-based violence, also known as violence against women, which you can think of as violence against a person related to their gender, which is often rooted in gender inequality in a society or culture. For instance, in male-dominated societies, and there are a lot of male-dominated societies, women have less power socially and oftentimes economically. This puts them in a position where they may be, for instance, trapped at home or feeling like they are trapped at home, which can lead to issues of domestic violence. For instance, because of COVID-19, everyone, for the most part, is stuck in their homes. Because men and women no longer are out, for the most part, working more than they used to, at least, when the disease was first spreading around, we saw an uptick in gender-based violence. Researchers were wondering what was going on here, and what really happened was, since men and women were just in closer contact for extended periods of time, rates of gender-based violence increased in the United States, for instance, as well. So gender and power, which we will get into shortly, have a great impact in a given society on the health of those that are, for instance, less privileged than, let's say, a white male. And sidebar to that is intimate partner violence, which tries to be more inclusive of different forms of violence. For instance, woman-on-man violence or same-sex violence, because those are also really impactful things that happen in our given societies. And it should not just be conceptualized as violence against women, which is the critique of that sort of nomenclature. That being said, women disproportionately are impacted by gender-based violence. Additionally, women of color are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence. Additionally, those that experience violence, let's say you are homosexual and your partner is battering you, sometimes they feel either guilty or somehow that they are to blame. This also applies to women experiencing violence as well. But there's an additional added intersectional problem that they sometimes experience where, for instance, if they do report it to the police, they may be fearing being outed, basically having people know that you're homosexual if they do not want that to be disclosed. Or, again, they may internalize the stigma in our society given homosexual individuals, less so than previously, but still a very real impactful factor in our society. And then additionally, there is the conception based on really clear evidence that sometimes when you do report findings of gender-based violence or man-on-man violence or woman-on-man violence, sometimes nothing really happens or you are blamed for your sexuality, which can of course be even more traumatizing. So when people ask, why don't you report to the police, there are definite barriers to doing so. So why does this sort of happen? And you can think about this as, again, with the example of transgender violence, that violating societal norms about gender or sexuality has or does result in physical punishment. The death penalty in some cases in the United States, for instance, as well, arbitrary arrests and torture, which still happens today, ill treatment in health facilities also still happens today, and forced sterilization. If you were unaware, in the history of the United States, homosexual individuals or those that were seen to be atypical in terms of their sexuality were sometimes sterilized in the United States. This was primarily done in the period called eugenics, or a movement called eugenics that happened in our history. But there still are cases, that this still happens throughout the world. But to ask ourselves why, and the answer really boils down to power, which is a subject we will get into very soon. So we're going to dive into some of the readings, and starting with that, we have Hooking Up Sexual Double Standard. So the first thing that I think that is important to sort of think about when you're looking at this article is the conception of being a good girl versus a bad girl. Good girls, according to the article, based on largely the history of the United States, are seen to be docile, not very sexual, essentially, while bad girls are the opposite of that. They do things that may be even considered to be things that men do. However, there's an added layer to that when you're a woman, where you might be conceptualized as being a slut, for instance, so slut shaming, that men largely don't experience. In fact, they are encouraged to have multiple sexual partners. Meanwhile, women are frowned upon for doing so. Why is that? There's a quote here that I want you to think about. The hookup culture on modern college campuses affords young people more freedom than ever before, yet there continues to be a double standard for the sexual lives of men and women. Why is it that men are encouraged to have multiple sexual partners while women are not? And what happens when women, largely, break the rules that we have built up in our society in terms of how we conceptualize gender power and sexual relations in the United States? Also, maybe pause this, because the sample could be conceptualized as being a little biased. For one, it's only on college campuses, and two, for the most part, this is only concerning heterosexual relationships. Does this apply to homosexual or bisexual relationships? Additionally, do you think that this conception of good girl versus bad girl is changing over time, or is slut shaming essentially still a pervasive thought on college campuses? I would say there largely is still a misconception that women are somehow being bad girls or being sluts for having multiple sexual partners. And this is very problematic, especially when we're talking about gender-based violence and sexual assault on campuses. Women are often blamed when they are the victims, for instance, for drinking too much or wearing clothes that were suggestive. That somehow men, being boys, and boys will be boys, that's the terminology that is thrown out, can't somehow resist the temptation that this offers them. This, of course, is not rooted in our biology. It's just how we talk about genders, very problematically. It's how we talked about genders in a way that often shapes or reifies the patriarchy, essentially, on college campuses in the United States in general, because colleges are not isolated. You go out and you, let's say, work a job, you interact with friends, you interact with family members, and this sort of college campus culture, is, if you want to think about it, also is shaped by the larger society. And this manifests in conceptions such as slut shaming, or that men are being promiscuous in a good light, essentially, also too. Keep in mind that STIs, or sexually transmitted infections, are very high on college campuses. Think about that added layer to that when individuals are having multiple sexual partners, regardless of their biological sex or gender. I'm going to shift towards the egg and the sperm because I'm talking about themes that Emily Martin is also engaging with and trying to elicit from the reader. So she says, I am intrigued by the possibility that culture shapes how biological scientists describe what they discover about the world. Before I move on, think about words you could replace with biological scientists. You could, for instance, place here college student, and the sentence would still make a lot of sense based on what I just said, given the last article. Excuse me. So, how we conceptualize the world, which I'm kind of hammering in and probably getting repetitive for some of you, is based on our cultural upbringing. How we conceptualize gender and biological sex is based on that upbringing. Think about the title here as well. How science has constructed a romance based on stereotypical male-female roles. In terms of how, for instance, biology textbooks have been written, in our history are that this is a process of sperm penetrating the egg, of little soldiers entering the female body, and the strongest one, the fastest one, will prevail. Think about this in terms of how we talk about men, how men should be dominant in our society, how men are in charge, they take a leadership role. We were seeing this in how scientists were talking about the egg and the sperm, because that's the language that they, largely as men, sort of could conceptualize it as. As Emily Martin goes on to say, it is remarkable how femininely, the egg behaves and how masculinely the sperm. The egg is seen as passive. In critique of how scientists largely have talked about the fertilization process, some feminist scholars, including Emily Martin, have taken a critical lens to this process and actually have shown, for instance, that you can also write it in a way that where it seems like the egg is the dominant thing. It consumes the sperm. It hunts it out. So it really just comes down to how you talk about the world. How we talk about the world shapes how we think about the world and how we interact with others. This can even boil down to something as seemingly objective as our biology. If certain individuals are writing the text, their cultural lens is going to shape how the text is written. There is a movement in sciences, largely in the social sciences, where you have to really conceptualize everything you have ever read as inherently biased. Bias doesn't necessarily mean wrong, but we need to externalize and talk about the biases that shape how we think about the world when we are talking about things that have a very real impact on us as human beings. So this largely is manifested in scholarship now that basically has like a personal biases or a positionality section in the writing. Basically say, hey, I'm a cisgendered white male researcher from my position of privilege writing about a topic that largely concerns women. I understand and recognize the problematics of doing so, and I have something that makes it so I may not have a full understanding of the female or women's experience. So I'm trying to do this in a manner that is open to critique. If that sort of text is included in the writing, the reader has a better understanding of who the author is and what kind of perspective or what do they bring to the table as well. For instance, in anthropology, there's a conception that it's good to also have that insider perspective. So for instance, women talking about women and researching women, but also because there is also a sort of culture of being a woman, there is some merits, for instance, for other perspectives to sort of look from the outside in and see what is going on. This also applies vice versa, of women critiquing or looking at the culture, the cultural practices that largely are male spaces as well. I bring this up because, again, we really need to think about the stereotypes largely about how we think about men and women. You can think about men are from Mars, women are from Venus, a very well-known adage, and also a book by the same name that critiqued those very same specific points. There is, again, nothing in our biology that says men must be dominant and women must be docile. There's nothing that says that the sperm are dominant and that the egg is docile. It's just how we talk about it, and that very real problematic consequences of doing so can manifest from the way we talk about and interact with the world. All right. And I'm kind of rapid firing through these articles because I'm expecting you to have read them. But also, if you have any questions concerning a lot of the concepts in these readings, or if you have any follow-up concerns or you don't understand something, reach out to me, of course. So that being said, we're going to move on to the cost of raising a transgender teen. The quote I have here, I like using quotes because they sort of broil down the larger themes of the readings. So find what we would call a representative quote if you ever really want to talk about or write about a certain writing. So Obtaining puberty-blocking hormones in elite medical settings systematically alienates transgender teens and their multi-marginalized families who lack white, heteronormative, and socioeconomic privilege. A lot of large words there that you may be unfamiliar with because they are kind of weighty scholarship terms. So, what this is trying to say is that largely minority individuals that identify as transgender have multiple barriers to entry to be able to get effective healthcare services. So what are those barriers? Economic, in terms of the very high cost of transgender services, for instance, HRTs, as well as the social stigma of getting such services. Let's talk about the cost first. What the author is trying to say by basically this becoming a middle class health concern is that those that, for instance, do not make a lot of money have a harder time accessing HRT services. Because of that, those that have more money that are undergoing these services will have a better access to doing so. And additionally, they may have better mental health metrics concerning their self-perception of their gender because they are able to access services which, in their mind, lets them transition. When this article says multi-marginalized, however, we must take into account other factors, including race and ethnicity. When people are talking about economics, and for instance the middle class, oftentimes they are also implicitly talking about white individuals, because white individuals largely make up the middle class, and for instance Black and Latino or Latinx individuals largely occupy what would be considered in terms of their economic status to be lower class or low class. This is talking in broad strokes, and of course there are exceptions to this, but these are the general trends that we're seeing. So, several confluences of struggling exacerbate the difficulty of raising a transgender teen when pre-existing conditions of family health include experiences with racism, homophobia, and straddling the poverty line. Let's add an additional layer here of talking about racism, not in terms just of economic status, but in terms of actual lived experiences with racism. It has been found in the scholarship for some time that experiencing racism actually becomes internalized as stress. And stress, of course, has a multitude of cascading consequences on our own health, in terms of our mental health, but also our physical health. For instance, when you are undergoing heightened periods of stress, your immune system becomes compromised. As a result, you may be more susceptible to infectious diseases. Let's think about COVID-19 burden for a second, going a little off topic. African American or Black American individuals in the United States have disproportionately been impacted by COVID-19 in terms of prevalence and also health consequences, including death. Some scholars postulated originally that there's something in the biology of Black individuals that made them more susceptible. This has been a common theme in the problematic discussions of race in the United States, where oftentimes health consequences, for instance, high blood pressure for African American men, is blamed on their biology, and not because, for instance, they're experiencing racism or they have limited access to healthy, nutritious food. In terms of this article, minority health already is impacted by a variety of different factors, including racism. Add the additional intersectional factor of, for instance, perceptions of them being, for instance, gay or homosexual, which may not even be the case if they are transgender. Again, sexuality does not translate to your gender, but homophobia is still present, and also transphobia for that matter. Additionally, remember this is talking about also transgender teens' parents as well, as they have to navigate this very real system, which they may be unfamiliar with because it is a very convoluted system that you sort of need to just know how to operate. This is called medical literacy. Basically, how well are you versed and skilled in the practice of understanding and interacting with the healthcare system. If, for instance, you are a heterosexual parent with a heterosexual partner, and your transgender teen wants to go undergo HRT services, you may be unfamiliar with what that even means, and certainly unfamiliar with how to access and navigate this very convoluted system. This becomes easier when you have higher access to resources, including, for instance, money, because you are able to go to, for instance, a clinic that is by you, as opposed to having to travel for some time to find someone that has your insurance covered as a package, for instance. Basically, a term that I'm going to be also kind of hammering in to you all if you're unfamiliar is heteronormative. And heteronormative means the expected norm is that you are heterosexual in the United States. When you're talking to somebody, for the most part, you are assuming that they are heterosexual. And this also manifests in how services are provided, for instance, also too in healthcare systems and also just in public health in general. So if people are assumed to be heterosexual as a norm, when people supposedly violate that norm, it can cause really very real consequences as people's expectations of your behavior are violated because of culturally understood and ingrained understandings of how the world works. Until such conceptions are changed in our larger society and culture in general, there's going to be discrimination towards different so-called races, so-called sexualities, and ways of being also too. We are approaching the finish line, I promise. However, there are two theories that I really want you to understand, or at least be familiar with when moving forward with this class. So, Michel Foucault was a French historian and also theorist, philosophizer, if you will, who conceptualized a lot of different theories that anthropology, even though he wasn't an anthropologist, has sort of adopted over time. I consider myself a scholar that is very versed in biopower, and I use it in my own writing. So how are we going to define this term? Biopower is the state's capacity and want to control its citizens' biology. Literally, I'm talking about their bodies here. When I'm saying the state, I mean, for instance, the United States, countries, or even at the county level or the state level as well. There really is different scales you can think about biopower. You can even think about it in terms of, for instance, you talking to a doctor who is telling you, for instance, to take a certain medication, or you need to undergo a certain procedure. You sort of implicitly just accept their opinion as fact because of their perceived expertise. However, when you're talking about the state, again, at the county level, state level, country level, they have the capacity, meaning they have the power to control your bodies. Think about the US prison system, for instance. The state has the legal authority to incarcerate you if you have broken a certain law. Once you are in the prison system, your agency, your personal autonomy to enact things of your own accord are very limited. You are, for instance, stuck in a small prison cell and you are watched by a prison guard. Or maybe you are in there with another individual without your say really in the matter. The state has the ability to do that. This also applies to our reproduction, especially concerning women's reproduction. It is interesting and also very disconcerting that in the history of basically every country, including especially the United States, that the majority of policymakers are men, but they are making policies that primarily concern women's reproduction. More women politicians than ever are currently in our Senate system. However, they are still a very small minority of the larger political body of the Senate and the House, for instance. So their ability to influence the control of women's bodies is, well, very limited, to say the least. When I'm talking about also the want of the state to control citizens' biology, think about, for instance, abortion. There is a want by the state based on the state. You can think about it as a entity, basically, with its own understanding of the world, to either promote having more children, which is called pronatalism, or to reduce the amount of children that are being born. This is called antinatalism. Pronatalism in countries oftentimes is linked to the majority religion in a certain country. For instance, in countries that have a predominantly Catholic religion, pronatalism is promoted, meaning that it is encouraged that the individuals in that state produce multiple children. In countries that are trying to control the amount of infants that are being born, they often promote family planning services. They might make abortion readily available. They might make Plan B readily available. They might make sterilization readily available. All right, so you can think of biopower as a large umbrella theory that other theories sort of fall into. One of those is called reproductive governance, which you can think of biopower, but specifically in terms of reproduction and sexual and maternal health. The mechanisms through which different historical configurations of actors, such as the state, so again, think about the state, the country, using legislative controls, so policy and laws, economic inducements, so for instance, a subsidy if you are wanting family planning services, which we really don't get in the United States, moral injunctions, meaning you are being a bad mother if you seek an abortion, which some countries do openly say in their discourses, direct coercion, meaning if you do not receive this service, you may be incarcerated, and ethical incitements to produce, monitor, and control reproductive behaviors and population practices. Again, the last slide of this is going to be talking about abortion in the US, which I think is a very salient example of biopower and reproductive governance. Basically, the state's ability and also their underlying reasons for controlling your reproduction, whether in the positive in terms of promoting multiple children, so again, natalism, or in the negative, promoting antinatalism. All right, the last slide, you made it. In 1973, Roe v. Wade, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but if not, was a Supreme Court case that basically said that families and women have the right to seek abortion services. However, the language that it was written was a little vague, intentionally, to reduce public backlash from largely conservative states, as an example. This sort of wishy-washy language of Roe v. Wade afforded some wiggle room for states to interpret the law as they saw fit. We're seeing this today right now in the erosion of abortion access through practices at the state level that aren't necessarily illegal, but they sort of are working against the intended purpose of Roe v. Wade. For instance, in certain states, including Florida, before a woman is allowed to seek an abortion service, she must undergo an ultrasound to basically look at the fetus. The intention is to discourage them from seeking an abortion. This, of course, is very problematic and potentially traumatizing for the woman or the family that is involved. Additionally, there are other convoluted laws and policies that are being made at the state level to restrict or make it more difficult seeking abortion services. For instance, there must be a hospital within X amount of miles from an abortion clinic, or this abortion clinic must be of a certain size. The door frame must be of a certain size. Very specific, very convoluted laws and policies that are largely there just to restrict abortion. But we must also ask, restrict abortion for who? Again, going back to the transgender teen article, what often happens is those that have the economic capacity to, for instance, travel to a different state with an easier access to abortion will often do so. What if you are a working mom that is unable to travel because that is a day off of work that you cannot afford? What if you don't have a car? This largely impacts women and families of color and minority populations. So it is easier for wealthy, largely white individuals to seek services when services are restricted, meaning there is a disproportionate evaluation of the reproductive ability of white women. This is called stratified reproduction, another sort of theory that falls within biopower. Basically, the state favors certain individuals' reproductive potential more than others. In the United States, this manifests in white women's reproduction being more favored in general based on other minority populations due to a mixture of racist policies in the US, economic capacities in the US. For instance, the majority of wealthy individuals are white in the US. And all of these sort of combine to create a context where, again, there's an added layer, an intersectional layer that primarily impacts minority populations. However, private entities have also stepped into this discussion. So, for instance, Hobby Lobby, which is a store where you can buy craft products primarily, got into a lot of hot water because they tried to argue that providing contraceptive services went against their religious freedom, basically, as an organization. This was protested, the store was boycotted, and they eventually did relent on their policy concerning contraceptive services. Additionally, Planned Parenthood, a nonprofit organization that provides a variety of services, not just abortion services, is constantly under fire by conservative politicians because of abortion, basically. Politicians argue that the state does not have the responsibility to, for instance, fund abortion services. However, Planned Parenthood, again, does not just provide abortion services. They provide sexually transmitted infection tests, they provide condoms free of charge, and other services for both men and women when you go to a Planned Parenthood center. Additionally, they oftentimes will have volunteers and escort families or women to abortion clinics because these clinics are often protested by individuals that are anti-abortion, for instance, too. So Planned Parenthood has multiple roles, but in 2016, when Trump was elected as president, immediately Planned Parenthood became under fire from politicians trying to restrict the amount of money that was being sent to this organization. I mention this because the state can be seen as stepping in to influence, again, reproductive capacity in the positive or the negative. The Supreme Court had to weigh in on the Hobby Lobby case. Politicians are weighing in on the Planned Parenthood situation. So we'll see what happens. There was a lot of fear when President Trump elected a conservative member of the Supreme Court that abortion laws, basically, the Roe v. Wade, was going to be overturned. This largely has not been seen to happen. However, there was a very real fear at the time of the election that it was going to. That fear is manifested by the state's ability to control reproduction through policy and laws and moral incitements and ethical inducements. In conclusion, as I'm reaching the 60-minute mark, just know that as a member of a society, you also have to obey the laws of that society. You also have to interact with others in that society that may have a different interpretation of the laws of that society. That's really complicated, and you may not know all of the laws and policies. What if you're talking to someone that's from outside the United States? You don't know their upbringing. You don't know the laws that were in place in their country, and vice versa, most likely. This is why it's really important and also difficult to sit down and really think about what you say and your actions and the actions of others and interpret them from a cultural relativist perspective. Because there are multiple underlying factors at the individual level, community level, neighborhood level, society level, cultural level that influence how people interact with the world. I'm not going to lecture on this, because I've lectured enough probably, but if you wanted to understand or know about the abortion policies in the US, take a minute to look at Florida in particular here. I tried to highlight text which I thought was important for you to really get at. So for instance, parents of a minor must be notified before an abortion is provided. Public funding is available for abortion only in cases of life endangerment. A patient must undergo an ultrasound before obtaining an abortion, and additionally only in cases of life or health endangerment can it be performed after 24 weeks of gestation. So take a minute to look at this and just see this is a very complicated topic.